All right, let's get started. It's about 6 now. So this is the first of the 2 Con History panels I'll be hosting. Both of them are back-to-back in the same room. So if you want to stay for the next 2 hours, it's going to kind of be a more continuous panel. We're going to have a little break in between, but this way I'm able to get both of the panel topics done kind of together. So the first hour, we're going to be talking about the history of the convention scene. Specifically, we're going to look at the rise of first fandom. The science fiction fans, I basically helped set the template for all cons to get started. And then a little bit about the furry and other fandoms that came from that scene. And then the second panel at 7 is going to be the history of cosplay at conventions. If you want to check out both panels, you can stay for the next 2 hours. Unfortunately, it looks like there were some internet issues, so I'm not able to get the versions of the slides that I had for this panel made for MFF loaded. So I'm using some old versions of my panel. Hopefully, the slides still kind of work. I might have to shuffle around back and forth to get it to sync up right. And it doesn't seem like there's any con staff or AV on hand, so I can't really get the audio set up. So I might just have to skip the videos for this panel. I think I'll have the videos online on my YouTube channel, so you can check that out there. But we're going to do the panel without any videos. And it does look like the screen is a bit small, so hopefully you all can see. If not, feel free to move to try to get a better view. But despite all the little hiccups, hopefully get this panel started and things go all right. So since this panel, the next 2 panels are kind of, they're all based on slides. I go in order. So if you have any questions, please try to save them towards the end so it doesn't disrupt the flow of the presentation. We're going to have a little break in between the 2 panels, and you can take questions around that time. I can take questions around that time as well. So let's get started. The first panel we're going to do covers the history of the convention scene. So I've been working on the Con History project for about a decade now. So I go, aside from vending at cons, I also go to cons and present panels on the history of conventions and fandoms. I also do a lot of interactive displays at cons to try to teach people the history of conventions. So this was one of the exhibit groups that I had at Worldcon in Seattle this year. And that's also my contact information if you want to contact me after the panel. Very easy to find me, it's just Con History everywhere. So conhistory.com, Con History on YouTube, and conhistory@gmail.com as well. So the panel we did last year at AmperCon was celebrating 85 years of conventions from Worldcon to today. That panel actually ended up winning the Ursa Major Award for Best Nonfiction Work for last year. So that was kind of great to see one of the panels actually win that award. So yeah, that's my Ursa Major Award right there, which is very nice. I got that one. Another project I'm working on right now is turning a lot of the early research on the convention scene into a graphic novel. I'm planning to release it as a webcomic. Originally, I was supposed to get the webcomic started by this weekend, but there were some slight delays. But you could pick up kind of the first issue of the comic at my booth, where you can pick it up here after the panel. They're $10 each, and it's about 32 pages covering the history of the convention scene, specifically the formation of fandom and the rise of the first fan club in 1929. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of these topics as well in this panel. So this is a panel I'll be doing at 7, so be sure to check that out if you want to stay around that long. These panels are dedicated to Mark, who is one of the founding fathers of the furry fandom. He sadly passed away last year, but he was a big help for some of the research I've been doing, and he actually attended one of the panels that I presented at BLFC. So it's nice to get to have him on that panel. So let's get started with the overall convention scene. So today, pop culture conventions, art conventions, basically any type of entertainment convention They're dominating the scenes now. They now attract crowds up to hundreds of thousands, and there are a bunch of varieties. You have your Comic Cons, your anime cons, and of course, your furry conventions. So there is a lot of differences between a lot of these cons now, but when we really break them down, you can see all these different conventions come from the same roots, as I show in the family tree. And so to kind of look at the where these cons emerged from, we really have to go back to the start of all this, almost 90 years ago, to the early roots to show how these early science fiction cons gave rise to all the different types of cons that we have to this day, including furries. In fact, if you were involved in the furry fandom in the early 90s and 2000s, you'll know how intertwined the furry fandom is with the science fiction fandom. So, yeah, it looks like some of the slides are out of order because of the internet hiccup, so let's switch over to the other slide then. So we'll start with this individual, Hugo Gernsback. Hugo Gernsback is basically the father of modern science fiction. Science fiction, of course, existed before Gernsback. There's a lot of debates of where science fiction came from. Most consensus is Mary Shelley is one of the first to kind of write science fiction. Some say it's Edgar Allan Poe. However, Hugo Gernsback was the first to use science fiction in the modern term that we have now. Originally, it was called science fiction, but the most important thing you have to know is science fiction for this period is kind of the catch-all term for pop culture. So when I mention science fiction, I'm not talking purely about space operas or time travel. Science fiction during this period and for the next 40 years of our history basically encompasses all space opera, fantasy, sword and sorcery, comics, animation, superheroes. So anything that we kind of associate now as a separate fandom, a separate type of convention, all was under the umbrella of science fiction during this time period. So it was with Hugo Gernsback and his two magazines, Amazing Stories and Wonder Stories, that we kind of got the rise of science fiction fandom, also known as first fandom, as it was progenitor fandom that all the other fandoms kind of took root from. So what Hugo Gernsback originally did, so these are some of the pages from my comic, he started republishing science fiction stories from H.G. Wells and Jules Verne's in his electronics magazines. So he was big in the radio hobby and tried to hook kids into the sciences during this time period. And he realized he started to have a larger and larger fan base of younger boys. So to start to appeal to the younger audience he was gaining, he decided to spin off his science fiction stories into Amazing Stories and then eventually Wonder Stories. Now, one of the things he did was originally he was just republishing pre-existing science fiction stories. Then he started to hire amateur writers to start writing short stories to fill the pages of his magazines. Now, this was during the period of the dime store novel and the pulps, so these short stories weren't getting literary recognition. So it was mostly these young fans who were really enthralled by this early science fiction and fantasy that wanted to form their own smaller communities to discuss their love of these stories. You also have to remember this also encompasses horror, detective, and mystery stories around the same time period. These types of pulp stories were not being discussed by literary critics as they weren't seen as literature, they weren't seen as art. They were seen as mere commodities, which was something that the young fans saw differently. They saw it as a form of escapism. So what Hugo did to fill the back pages of his magazine was publish letters from these early fans. And by publishing letters, he also published their full addresses, which allowed fans to start communicating with each other. So nowadays, this probably would be considered doxing and would be allowed, but it was basically the earliest forms for fans to communicate. So the earliest forms of social media. So this is where different young fans would communicate and write to each other in these letter columns, as you can see, publishing their addresses and names. And by being able to see where other fans lived, they were able to start communicating with other fans across the country, and thus they were able to form their own correspondence clubs. So the first unofficial fan organizations were correspondences, where fans from across the country and even as far as New Zealand would write to each other in these long, snail mail chain letters back and forth with each other. And eventually, these correspondence clubs would give rise to the first physical clubs, specifically the Scienceers, which was the first of these early clubs. The Scienceers was actually founded in 1929 by a bunch of young fans, specifically Alan Glacier, who's this individual right here, a young teenage fan, and he would write to other fans in New York City with this idea to form a club. Now, the original members of the Scienceers were basically young teenagers, mostly Jewish teenagers. However, they got their only adult member, an African-American gentleman named Warren Scott Fitzgerald. And as he was the oldest member of the club, he was nominated as the president and allowed these young fans to meet in his house in Harlem. And thus his Harlem apartment became the first fan club meeting site. So that's a forgotten part of science fiction history, because predominantly most of the early history is focused on white individuals, but the first club president was African American, and that's something that has kind of been forgotten. So I do want to point this out. Now, from these early clubs, like the Scienceers and the Science Correspondence Clubs, they started to publish club zines, so club magazines, where they would publish their own articles and even their own fan-written stories. Now, during this time period, again, the notion of science fiction was still a new emerging idea. So these early club zines were more focused on science. So these were fans of science writing about science. Eventually, they would start publishing short stories, and specifically, it was when Julius Schwartz, who is now known as one of the editors for DC Comics, but he was a young teenager around this time period, and he helped form with other individuals like Alan Glacier and Mort Weitzinger, the Time Traveler, which most fan historians consider the first fanzine, as it published short stories written by fans. And this also gave rise to fans actually writing fictional stories about each other. So fans writing about fandom. These fanzines and club zines also included articles and updates about the early fandom during this period. So you could start seeing the emergences from these zines to building this larger and larger community. Now, what Hugo Gernsback did was he was so interested in this new idea of these fans forming their own clubs, he decided to help promote his magazines at the Scienceers meeting, and he even rented out the American History Museum to host a special lecture for these young fans. About 30 members attended. Unfortunately, he didn't pay the bill, so these young teenagers were stuck with the bill, and that basically killed their club, unfortunately, because it was a high cost. But from this, he got the idea to make his own official fan club, and this gave rise to what we know as the Science Fiction League. So here's a graph I made that showed some of these early fan-made clubs. to eventually giving rise to Hugo Gernsback creating the Science Fiction League, which is now the first official fan organization. And the Science Fiction League would have specific members from all across the country, with the most prominent being in Philadelphia, in Chicago, and in Los Angeles. Keep your eyes on Los Angeles because this one will play a very, very big role in the formation of Star Trek fandom, anime fandom, and furry fandom as well. Let's see if we go back to the other slides now. So from these early science fiction clubs, you also get the rise of fan personalities. So people who became famous for simply being very loud, prominent fans, and the first fan personality is an individual named Forrest J. Ackerman. He will later become a editor for many famous science fiction writers, including Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov. And I'll discuss this later in the panel, but he's also the first cosplayer, and he's responsible for coining a lot of terms that we still use to this day. So, for example, the word pen name is something that he coined, as well as the word sci-fi is another term that he coined. In fact, there's an entire fan encyclopedia of all the different words that he's coined. He's very big in into Esperanto, so he promoted Esperanto. And most famously, he had a big influence on the horror fandom for creating the magazine Famous Monsters of Filmland, which is arguably responsible for preserving the horror fandom and making the horror fandom what it is today, as well as co-creating the comic character Vampirella. So from these early science fiction chapters, you start seeing different groups emerge, but specifically it's the New York chapters where most of the early fandom politics are going to get started. And yes, fandom politics is a really big thing because the idea of what fandom is, again, is new. So I want to point out that before this period, the term fandom was first applied to baseball fans. And now there were fans of literary characters and authors, like fans of Sherlock Holmes, fans of Jane Austen novels, but what they were mostly middle-class book clubs. They weren't really fandoms as we associate them with to this day. So the notion of what a fandom was outside of a book circle was kind of emerging during this period. And from this, you started to have attempts for meetings. So you started to have what the early science fiction fandom would consider their first conventions. Now, by my modern definition, these would be the equivalent of meetups. I wouldn't consider these conventions, but they laid the roots for the convention scene, which is why they're important. So in the science fiction fandom, the definition of a convention is any two clubs from different areas of the country or world meeting together is considered a convention. So the first attempted convention was the Science Fiction League meeting, which was held in New York, where science fiction fans from Chicago were supposed to drive to New York and make it to this meeting. They actually arrived a day late. So most science fiction fans, historians said, if the Chicago fans made it a day earlier, that would have been considered the first convention. But by most consensus, the science fiction fandoms consider the convention in Philadelphia, which is retroactively named PhilCon, as the first convention. So it was the 10 attendees, specifically from New York City, meeting fans in Philadelphia, which is considered the first convention. Now, where did the term convention come from? This was during an election year, and Philadelphia was home to the Democratic National Convention. So this fan, Don Lohman, who's going to play a big role in this story, he decided to say, hey, let's call this little meetup a convention, and thus that's where the name convention came from. It was copied off of the political conventions. So what did they do during this first convention? A small group of New York fans went up to meet a small group of Philadelphia fans. The Philadelphia fans took them to their house, showed them their science fiction collections, and they basically, hung out and went to the soda bar and, had food. And remember, these are teenagers who are doing this. So essentially what this first convention was is what we might be consider a meetup. However, you'll start seeing the formation of a lot of these early individuals playing big roles in the later fandom. So let's actually look, since we have this picture out, let's kind of look at these two individuals first. Let's see. There we go. All right. So basically, it is these three New York fans who basically have a giant influence on the formation of fandom as we know it. However, they're not well recognized to this day. But I do want to point out this first individual here. His name is Will Sikora. Will Sikora is what you call a Gernsbackian idealist. The idea that Gernsback was trying to promote with his science fiction magazines was that these science fiction stories are supposed to inspire young readers to get into a career in science. So because of this, Sikora took the notion that a fandom should inspire people to get into a professional career, specifically a professional career in science. And he was a young scientist himself. He was one of the first to use his fan club to test rocket mail, and he also wrote one of the first club songs, which we might consider one of the first folk songs. These other two individuals here represent the more political left of the early science fiction fandom, specifically these two individuals, Don Woolman and John Michel. Don Woolman originally, basically, I guess he would be the equivalent of a troll in early fandom. There was a lot of fake fan feuds during this period, and he often liked to take the role of being the rebellious leader against whatever the fandom was trying to do during this time period. So there was a mock feud in this early period called the Staple War, where it was, should we bound fan magazines with staples or without staples? And so he took the side of promoting staples. Now, Don Woolman wrote his first science fiction stories, and it was published in a magazine owned by Hugo Gernsback. Hugo Gernsback did not pay him, and thus he decided to sue Hugo Gernsback to get his money back. And I think after lawyer fees, he probably got about $10 from the lawsuit. However, he then tried to publish another story by Hugo Gernsback under another pen name, and it got published and he wasn't paid. So this basically made him the opposite of Sikora, where as opposed to being inspired by Gernsback, he promoted the idea of the Gernsback delusion, that science fiction fandom in the Gernsbackian notion was non-existent. And because of that, a fan who was a few years younger than him, John B. Michel, was able to convert him to socialism and communism. John Michel was a radical communist. He was a teenager during this period, but he was heavily attending young Communist Party meetings. And in fact, he wrote another fan song during this period called the Science Fiction International, as well as promoting his own socialist ideas. In fact, his ideas became known as Michelism, which is his notion of science fiction being a tool to try to promote a new technocratic utopia. So but the problem was Michel stuttered when he spoke. So he was able to write grand political ideas, but he couldn't speak them well. So basically, Woolman became the individual and the leader and the face of this new movement where he was able to eloquently talk. So basically, he was like the Hassan Piker of this period in more ways than one. And together, these three first united with each other to try to take down Hugo Gernsback. Because of that, all three of them were expelled from the Science Fiction League. So what happened was Woolman and Michelle started a harassment campaign to take down all the leaders of these different science fiction clubs. So they would use these fanzines like Twitter and spread smears and lies to attack these people, eventually trying to shut down each of these chapters one by one and replace it with their own fan clubs. So with that, they actually were able to successfully bankrupt Hugo Gernsback, who lost control of the Science Fiction League and was forced to sell his magazines. And thus, these three individuals start the next period of fandom called Second Fandom. And this is where politics now enters the convention scene. So this is where we start seeing some of these early cons really get started. So now that they have successfully taken down Hugo Gernsback, after that first Philadelphia meeting, they decide to hold a proper convention that takes a closer model to what we now know as the convention model, where they will rent out a hall to basically have organized programming and speeches. And this brings us to the first national convention in New York City, held in 1937. So basically, this is the early programming, and as you can see, there's no vendor hall during this time period. There's no separate panel rooms. It was basically one hall where there was different speeches, including songs. So you could see music has a big influence in science fiction and early fandom during this period, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Another thing these fans like to do, so you would have your club meetings, but it was what was called the after meetings where most of the fan fun was taking place. So they would go to local diners and soda bars and basically spend the nights just having fun after their meeting, including creating their own concoctions, including this, the science fiction special, which was made up of a bunch of was a banana split made up of different flavors of ice cream and star sprinkles. Another recipe called the science fiction super special added gin and alcohol, and thus we might call this the first convention drink. Specifically because at the next convention, the third convention in Philadelphia, they basically hijacked the hotel elevator and turned it into a makeshift bar. So the hotel staff had to chase the con-goers up and down these elevator as they were making this concoction, most likely the science fiction special. So as you could see, these young teenagers were having just as much fun in the 30s as we are at these cons now. So this is probably the first instance of alcohol at a convention. Now, the other notable thing that happened during this period was Dawn Woolman was given a speech by Michelle called Mutation or Death. And Mutation or Death was a long rant against the notion of the Gernsbackian ideal. Again, the notion of fandom was still very malleable during this time period. So this speech basically said the Gernsbackian ideal is dead because fandom has not inspired anyone to get into a professional science field. What fandom has inspired a new generation of science fiction writers and fan personalities. And thus, fandom as itself seems to be a more escapist notion. So it's making people want to stay in the fandom. So they decided to counter against this. Fandom should have a political purpose, and they argued that they should turn the notion of fandom into a political group that would send representatives to the Communist Party meetings and try to make grand political statements like we are for a war, we're against the war, we're for this, we're for that. So this idea became known as Michellism and started this new group called the Futurians. The Futurians were a group that fought for the notion that fandom should be a political force, that fans should be political, mainly led by Woolman and John Michel. Sakura at this time was very upset because not only was Woolman destroying all the different science fiction clubs, he was also destroying the clubs that they ran with Sakura. So Sakura decided to team up with some other people that the Futurians have alienated, including a young fan in Newark called Sam Moskowitz, and the leader of the Queen's Science Fiction League named James Dasari, who had the Queen's Science Fiction League destroyed by Woolman, and they decided to form a new group called New Fandom. And the purpose of New Fandom was fandom should be fun. Fandom shouldn't be political. Fandom should just, be a force for fun. And so now these two groups started to fight it out to host the first Worldcon. So after Michelle and the Woolman gave that mutation or death speech, everyone voted them down because this was back when cons were like political conventions where you had gavels and votes and motions. So one guy basically stood up and said, I'm here because I like science fiction. What's with all this politics and stuff? So that was kind of the notion between the two. The problem was, a year ago, Sakura and Woolman were best of friends, and they had the idea, New York is going to be hosting the World's Fair. This will be the first time a lot of our international friends will be coming specifically to New York. So why not host a 3-day science fiction convention in conjunction with the World's Fair? And since it was Woolman's idea, Sakura nominated Woolman to be the con chair for that first convention. However, now that they are split, they were fighting to host that first Worldcon. And they would attack each other in fanzines with each other. So they would sling mud, calling the Futurians communists and Stalinists, and calling New Fandom Nazis, which was not really fair, though. Some of them were, these were, young white teenagers, so some of them probably did have some racist views during this time period. However, there was also a lot of friction with the Futurians as well, because even though they were communists, they were the Stalinist-style communism, and this was during a time period where Stalin and Hitler signed that pact with each other and invaded Poland. So even some of the leftist members of science fiction were kind of hesitant to side with the Futurians. So within these fanzines, they would start attacking each other to host that first Worldcon. Eventually, New Fandom won out and became the con runners for that first Worldcon, the first 3-day convention. And that first Worldcon is going to lay the stage for all the conventions to come. So while science fiction fans don't consider Worldcon the first convention, by my definition, looking at all cons in general, everything that was started at Worldcon can be traced to every anime, furry, brony, Star Trek, and Comic-Con to this day. So let's talk about that first Worldcon. So here is the con book for that first Worldcon, divided into 3 days with their own speeches. They had a charity auction, they had a guest of honor, and they had a banquet. So you start seeing a lot of different things that we now associate with conventions. But like I said, it was these groups that were fighting with each other. So while Sakura's side, New Fandom, was able to host that first Worldcon, the Futurians were very, very upset. But it's this Futurian right here who starts to cause a bit of trouble. This is David A. Kyle, and he is the first individual to publish a comics fanzine, and thus most people consider him the grandfather of comics fandom. So he was away at art school for the year, and when he came back from art school, he saw that his friends who were originally the con runners for Worldcon have now been supplanted by New Fandom, and that got him really upset. So he used his father's printer and published a bunch of these pamphlets called A Warning. And this pamphlet basically argued that new fandom is a dictatorship and will suppress any free speech at Worldcon. So he printed a bunch of these little booklets and hid them in the AC unit of the convention venue, which was in Caravan Hall. However, he didn't have time to distribute them before the con staff found them. And the con staff found all these pamphlets and blamed it on Woolman and Michelle and the Futurians, who actually had no idea what these pamphlets were. So at this point in time, Woolman and Michelle basically kind of gave up on trying to be political and just said, hey, we just want to attend the con for fun now, just to see how it is, since all our friends are there. However, because they were blamed for printing this pamphlet, 6 Futurians, including Michelle and Woolman, were exiled from the con, and this was called the Great Exclusion Act. And they were known as the Exiled Six. So this is actually from the zine that was printed by a female Futurian. She published this within 24 hours. She drew and published and printed this within 24 hours. And she basically drew the front of the convention center where they were kicked out of the con, which I think is impressive how fast they were able to do this back then. So inside the convention center, it was the 4th floor of Caravan Hall where the con was mainly held. Mostly all the features were held in this room. So what the Futurians were trying to do was get on the elevator and make it to the 4th floor. So there was a lot of fighting with the Futurians trying to get to the floor and the new fandom and con staff trying to push them back. And eventually the Futurians gave up and went to sulk at a cafe across the street and basically just watched the con happening from across the street, which we'll get to later. Now, a lot of firsts came from this early Worldcon, including this fanzine from an Oklahoma fan that drew his impressions of that first Worldcon, which included this long line to get into the venue, which is something that has been around for the next 80 years afterwards. So long lines for cons have been a tradition as well. So this is a BLFC, so it's a thing. A lot of notable individuals who would become big in the science fiction and comic scenes attended that very first Worldcon. So the guest of honor was Frank All Paul. He was a cover artist for a lot of these different magazines during this period. But what's interesting is a lot of people who would be important members of DC Comics, including Julius Schwartz and Mort Weitzinger, the individuals who published that first fanzine, The Time Traveler, Otto Binder, who was one of the Chicago fans who tried to attend that first convention and would later be one of the creators of Supergirl, and of course Jerry Siegel, one of the co-creators of Superman, all attended that convention. And young teenagers, Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov, before they published the first stories, were also attendees. And the youngest attendee of that con was a 13-year-old Ken Kruger, who would later become one of the co-founders of San Diego Comic-Con. So you could start seeing the roots of a lot of the early scenes from a lot of these individuals who attended that first convention. What's interesting is that con actually made profit. So they actually made $23 in profit that year. Probably the only con in this period to actually not end in red, because since then most cons would end in red. Now, another thing that they had was the first Dead Dog party. So Mort Weitzinger, after the con was over, had a bunch of extra alcohol at his house, and he invited con staff and attendees, including Jerry Siegel, to come to his house to finish off the extra alcohol. This was around the time of the Great Depression, and during the Great Depression, the term for empty liquor bottles was called a dead dog, and thus this is where the Dead Dog party got its name from. This has been adapted by all cons now, to the point Dead Dog also refers to the last event of the con, including the Dead Dog panel and the Dead Dog dance. So this again starts a lot of the early roots for what we now associate with cons and parties. Now, one of the interesting things, like I said, the Futurians were at this cafe across the street. Now, one of the members of the Futurians was a young Isaac Asimov. And he was actually allowed to go into the con, and he kind of felt like he was a traitor for betraying his Futurian friends. In fact, Leslie Perry, the one who published that zine within 24 hours, actually made Asimov go on stage to give a speech, and Asimov did a little speech, and at the end she was upset because he didn't say anything about the Futurians. So he kind of felt like he was a traitor, but he was hungry, so he had to go eat at the cafe across the street, and he thought he would be shunned by the Futurians who were exiled. But on the other hand, the Futurians actually brought him to their table and asked them what was happening inside the con, and thus he actually became their spy on the inside and would go back and forth across the street and report on what was happening at the con to the Futurians. On the last day of the con, the Futurians held a rival convention so basically the first Spite Con, and if you saw what was happening with all the furry cons in New Jersey this year, that's basically what was happening here. But these Futurians all decided to meet up and discuss the future for the fandom. First, the Futurians kind of admitted that they were wrong to try to make fandom political, and that maybe the idea of a fandom just being for fun escapism was probably the right way to go. So that actually leads to the irony of ironies, because the Futurians, their motto for what fandom should be lost out, but the Futurians would become very, very influential in the 50s and 60s as famous editors publishing science fiction, and thus became very prominent in the later science fiction scene. However, new fandom, even though their motto for conventions and fandom won out, because they banned the Futurians, they were shunned by the rest of fandom, and thus as an organization basically dissolved afterwards. Some more ironies from this entire situation. Don Woolman, who was radicalized to socialism and communism because Hugo Gernsback didn't pay him for his stories, would later become an editor and fail to pay his own writers for their stories. In fact, he famously published The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings in the United States without permission from the Tolkien estate. Unintentionally starting one of the counterculture movements, because now that these works of Tolkien's were now published in cheap paperback form, bootleg paperback form, young college students could read them. So some argue this gave rise to the fantasy culture, nerd culture in the college scene in the 50s and 60s. Another irony is that David A. Kyle, the person who published those pamphlets and was responsible for getting his friends banned, would later become the con chair for Worldcon when it came back to New York in the 1950s. And he would, and it was expensive because they had a guest of honor who was giving a speech at the banquet. So to raise money for the guest of honor, you had to pay for a banquet table to get in. So thus a lot of poor attendees couldn't watch the banquet and the guest of honor speech. So they would sit on the hotel balcony and try to listen to the guest of honor speech. So Kyle would send his con staff, security staff, to clear out the attendees. And this was called the Second Exclusion Act. So it was ironic, and it actually gave birth to a meme where everyone would repeat, David Kyle says you can't sit here, David Kyle says you can't sit here. So I just think it's kind of ironic. And the other irony is Sakura, who thought science fiction fandom should make people want to become professionals, and that the notion of fandom was more escapist, would later try to become the leader of science fiction fandom later in his life. So it's like all these ironies and ironies. Now, one thing that this first Worldcon had was also a softball game between the New York and the Philadelphia fans. And for the next few years, a softball game would be a tradition at these early science fiction cons, which sadly was, removed, because I would think if we had them to this day, like a softball game between Trekkies and Bronies might be fun, but sadly that's something that has not continued. Now, one of the things that was discussed at this rival convention was this Worldcon was so great, why don't we host another Worldcon? And thus, just like the World's Fair and the Olympic, the notion came about that every year, another city should host Worldcon. So Worldcon should become a moving convention, and Chicago was given the reins to host the second Worldcon. So this year, Worldcon is in Seattle. Next year, it's going to be in LA. So Worldcon still keeps this idea of moving from city to city. And I'll discuss where this comes into play when we talk about the room parties. So with Chicago as the next venue, we could go to Forrest J. Ackerman. We're going to talk about this in the cosplay section later, but he was the first cosplayer dressing up at that first Worldcon. So there's a picture of his outfit. His girlfriend at the time, Meryl Douglas, is also known as the first cosplay maker for making his costume, and she would become influential for basically starting for turning her room into a costume changing room, which thus became the first cosplay lounge and first con suite, which is something that has been a tradition at a lot of science fiction cons to this day. And if it's a furry con that was started in the 90s, probably has a con suite as well. So in Chicago, you start seeing a lot of new firsts on the cosplay scene, but most importantly is you get the first organized folk music. So filk was actually a typo from science fiction folk music in the 1950s. Karen Anderson, a cosplayer, spotted this typo and decided the term filk should just be the term for fan music. So what was the fan music during this period? Well, I can't play it for you now since the audio is not connected, but we could start with these Futurians. Like I said, the Futurians were socialists. So they would sing union protest songs at these conventions and early meetings. And a lot of times these cons were held in hotels. And in the hotels, there's normally always a piano in the lobby or an empty boardroom where people could bring their guitars and just form the chairs in a circle and start playing these music. So they would originally start singing protest songs and folk music. A lot of times it was religious folk music. And over time, the words to these songs were lost. And they started to replace these with songs about their favorite fictional characters like Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon. And eventually when Star Trek comes into play, they will start singing about Kirk and Spock. And this basically gives rise to fan music. And the fan music was often very impromptu. They didn't have dances and concerts like we had now. They were essentially just empty panel rooms where people would just come and sing, or everyone would sing in a circle in the hotel lobby around the piano. So a lot of different early science fiction music was published, but it was at that second Worldcon in Chicago where some of these lyrics were actually published in the con book, where we get the first organized folk music. So here are some of the early folk circles. I actually took this picture in Chicago and Seattle this year, but you can see the tradition of folk from these early conventions, where you start seeing a rise of a bunch of different type of fan music. So a lot of this follows in the tradition of more folksy style songs. A lot of it is political protest songs. Leslie Fish is a leftist anarchist, so kind of follows in that tradition, and she writes more political sounding songs. The Doorside Irregulars is one of these. Oh, sorry? Yep.
Leslie Fish died about a week ago.
Oh, she just died about a week ago. Okay, that's very unfortunate. So, I guess rest in peace to Leslie Fish. Though I'm not going to say anything about her right now. The Doorside Irregulars are one of the con security forces on the east coast of the United States, just like Flair is kind of on the west coast. But the Doorside would also have their own song lists and different songs. So we're going to skip through the costume stuff, so that's going to be the second part of the panel. But these early science fiction cons would start forming the basis for a lot of the cons that we have to this day. So the hotel block model, the banquet becomes a very, very big part of these early science fiction cons still to this day. And of course, we gave rise to con badges. Con badges and lanyards start forming in these early science fiction cons as well. But most importantly, they gave rise to the con ribbons. So con ribbons become a very, very big part of the science fiction cons, where if you go to a science fiction con, their lanyards are just like yards and yards long because they just have a bunch of ribbons hanging off. In fact, you can see it's just basically a contest of who could collect a lot of the most badge ribbons. And look at all these early badges. You could see like the early roots to these badge ribbons as well, and a lot of these early conventions. So this is something that the Science Fiction Con started that made its way over to all the cons that branched off from science fiction as well. But most importantly was the room parties. So science fiction cons had a room party floor because, like I said, science fiction was a catch-all term for all pop culture during this period. So when you were the default pop culture convention, how did different fans meet up with each other? Nowadays, we would have specific meetups and panels for these different fandoms, but during this time period, there was only one panel room, so very, very limited panel times. So what these cons would do is they would put a giant bulletin board or community board in the lobby of the hotel where people could write their room number, a time, and what fandom they were a part of. So someone might write, Hyatt 502, Doctor Who fans meet at 8 p.m. And this is how different fandoms would start meeting up with each other. And it's from these early room parties where these individual fandoms would really solidify and become born. And when these room parties became big enough, would eventually branch off and become their own separate conventions. So here are some more recent room parties. A lot of them are themed, like the Klingon party at different cons. But most importantly this is where the cities who are bidding to host the next Worldcon would host their parties. Because the vote to host which city will host the next Worldcon, the voting ballot box was normally on the party floor. So it's believed the city that threw the best party would be able to host the best Worldcon, and thus these cities would try to compete for hosting a lot of these parties. So for example, this was at the DC Worldcon where Glasgow was hosting their bid party. So these room parties were important because it played a role on which city would end up hosting the next year's Worldcon, and nowadays it's the next Worldcon the year after. A lot of different parties and cons started to merge, so the idea of a full party con was formed in 1949, and this gave rise to a new type of convention called a relaxicon. So as opposed to an organized convention with the strict panels, guests of honor, dealer's hall, back then the dealer's hall was called the huckster's hall, art show, all that stuff, what they wanted to do was rent out a full hotel and just make it entire party convention, and this gave rise to the relaxicons. So for example, my friend Shugnazi, who is based out of Las Vegas, hosts Flock, which is a furry convention that basically rents out an entire hotel just so no outsiders are able to come in, and they just host a 2-3 day party convention. If you go to Texas, in Dallas, you have Furry Siesta, which is a sister con to Furry Fiesta. Furry Siesta essentially started as a furry relaxicon. So relaxicons still continue to this day. However, the idea of a room party culture really got started at the 9th Worldcon in New Orleans in 1951, where one individual who was hosting a fan party, so Frank Diaz, was kicked out of his hotel room because his party was too loud. So he basically went to another guy's hotel room, room 770, and decided to continue his party there. And this party lasts 2 days. And this party gave rise to the notion of what was called all-night fandom. So most parties would end before midnight, so people could wake up in time for the panels the next day. This was the first time a party went throughout the entire night and would basically end early in the morning with bloodshot eyes attendees going to the diner and eating breakfast to, survive the next day of the con. So this gave rise to, like I said, the notion of the all-night fandom, and Room 770 becomes a term for all-night fandom merrymaking during this period, and kind of still is today in the science fiction fandom. So like I said, there's a bunch of different themed parties. One of the famous ones is the Hugo Winner Party. So if you won a Hugo Award, you were invited to this exclusive party. However, George R. R. Martin, who lost the Hugo Award in 1976, decided to host a Hugo Losers Party, which he ended up hosting until 2021. And that was the year a blog post called George R. R. Martin Can F Right Off Into His Son was nominated for a Hugo Award, which probably played a role in why he stopped hosting the Hugo Losers Party after that. It's kind of weird that a blog post was nominated for a Hugo Award, but that's, modern science fiction fandom. So the first major, okay, it looks like I'm coming close on the 1 hour mark. So I'm going to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the next section, and it might cross over into the time that we have for the cosplay stuff, but I think it also kind of works with cosplay. So I'm going to try to cover the next section. If you want to say for the cosplay panel, I will probably start it right as soon as this section's ending. But I kind of want to talk about the major conventions that emerged from these room parties. The first were the Comic Cons. So the first Comic Con was actually founded by a young high schooler out of New York. Start seeing a similar story. All these cons seem to start by teenagers out of New York City. So one high schooler named Bernie wanted to make a convention specifically for the comics fandom, because comics fandom was considered a subsection of science fiction fandom during this period, much like how most furries like to say bronies are a subsection of the furry fandom. So it was argued in the comics zines, to be their own true fandom, they have to have their own convention. And Bernie was offering his house to host one of these conventions. Eventually, he was able to get, I believe it was a school gymnasium, to host a one-day Comic-Con called New York Comic-Con, which is the first true comic convention. Now, the New York Comic-Con is completely separate from the modern repop New York Comic-Con, but this is the one that started the trend. Most famously, he actually tried to get both DC and Marvel editors to help sponsor his convention. So he went to the DC's DC offices in New York City, and the editor of DC Comics at the time was, guess what? It was Julius Schwartz, who was the one who printed the first comic book for Worldcon. And when he was pitching this idea for a comic convention, Julius Schwartz was like, if you want to see a real convention, he tossed the Worldcon con book at him. That was a real convention, the one we hosted in 1939. And Bernie basically said, I don't care about your old people conventions. We're starting a new convention for young comics fans. And he was booted out of DC's offices then. Most famously, this is the only convention that was attended by Spider-Man co-creator Steve Ditko. And also, this was the first convention attended by a 19-year-old George R. R. Martin as well. So this was actually his 16-year-old George R. R. Martin. This was actually his first convention. So the Comic Cons started to slowly merge from these early events, branching off of science fiction cons. Eventually, you had Ken Kruger, that 13-year-old kid who attended that first Worldcon, moving to San Diego and starting his own comic shop. So he would end up bumping into a very, very loud con runner personality named Shale Dorf. So maybe the Uncle Kage of early comics fandom, I like to say, but this is an Uncle Kage who runs who tries to start up a bunch of different comics conventions. So Shale Dorf, Ken Kruger, as well as another person we're going to talk about when we get into the cosplay section, started San Diego Comic-Con, which really started to lay the templates for all the different cons to come to play. The Chicago Comic-Con was actually started by a female con runner, and this is where we start seeing the rise of female con runners in a predominantly male-dominated fandom during this period. Chicago Comic-Con was eventually bought up by Wizard World, became Wizard World Chicago, and then Fan Expo bought them up, and now it's Fan Expo Chicago. But this is where we get the rise of two new types of additions to the convention scene. You had the dealer's room and you had the artist alley. The dealer's room would first sell old secondhand comics. During this period, it was known as the Huckster's Hall. But the artist alley was the more interesting thing because it had professional industry artists basically sell their original artwork, do autograph signings, and do on-site con commissions. So starting a new type of artist alley during this time period. Now, the term artist alley is going to be used for a bunch of different types of conventions, but I'm going to use the term industry artist alley to distinguish it from the later fan art artist alleys during this period. But this was also contemporaneous with the underground comic movement. Mainly, you had Austin, Texas, and San Francisco, where these underground comic artists started to form with comic zines. Specifically, you had the Texas Mafia, the air pirates who were responsible for that Mickey Mouse comic, the Lewd Not Safe for Work Mickey Mouse comic, which caused the Copyright Act to be extended to protect Mickey Mouse from this. But this is also where you get the rise of anthropomorphic zines, specifically with Robert Crumb's Fritz the Cat, and Steve Gallacci starting to make his own furry space opera, Albedo, which he would also display artwork in the art show at these conventions during this period. So this is where we start getting more anthropomorphic zines through the underground comic zines. As the underground comics movement was happening in the United States, Japan was experiencing a very similar underground comics movement called Dondinshi. Dondinshi was very, very similar to what the Tijuana Bibles were in the United States, where Dondinshi would take popular anime and manga characters and make short little 8 to 10 page porno comics essentially with them. 90% of it is adult, and this is where we get the rise of yaoi and yuri stories. And eventually, these Dondinshi circles would start overflowing the science fiction cons of Japan until eventually they were kicked out of the Japanese science fiction cons and decided to form their own convention, Comic Market, which we know as Comic-Ket, the first of these new types of conventions, which gave rise to the Fan Artist Alley, where people were drawing unlicensed IP characters, fan art, and making adult comics for them. Star Trek fandom started to do the same thing with shipping zines as well. So this is where we get the emergence of these different types of artist alleys. Now let's go back to that Los Angeles Science Fiction League that Hugo Gernsback started, because it survived the downfall of Hugo Gernsback and became rebranded as the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society. Here, like I said, Ackerman and Murillo were prominent members of this early club, including this individual who started what is believed to be the very first lesbian magazine in the world. Ray Bradbury, Robert A. Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard were also members of this fan club. It's actually believed this is where L. Ron Hubbard and Robert A. Heinlein had a bet of who could start a religion first during this club. But most importantly, this is also where we get this individual, B-Roll Trimble, as an individual who started the Save Star Trek campaign, which arguably is responsible for extending Star Trek for a third season, and thus would give rise to the new Star Trek culture. Bijo also started the art show with Project Art Show when Worldcon was in Pittsburgh, where PantherCon later moved to. So the idea of having an art show was something that Bijo was trying to promote, and eventually she ended up making it a staple of Worldcon, and eventually other science fiction cons will adopt the art show, to the point that even San Diego Comic-Con was so impressed with her art show, she was hired on to run their art show. And since furry cons came off of science fiction cons, a lot of old furry conventions like this one still have an art show, because that is a tradition that comes from that science fiction scene. Now, another thing that was happening during this time period, like I was saying, there was only one panel room, and thus there's only one panel happening at that same time. So here is some programming from these different science fiction cons during this period. The idea of having one panel room existed during this time period, but the problem was, like I said, Star Trek fandom was on the rise, and thus you had a new influx of Star Trek fans flooding these science fiction cons, and thus the scheduling for these cons will be filled with Star Trek panels, which kind of cause a lot of trouble because now a lot of the old guard science fiction fans then want to go to Star Trek panels because they didn't care about this new hit show, whatever. And then the younger Star Trek fans then want to go to the old school panels. So after 40 years of only having one panel room, cons finally got the brilliant idea of, hey, we can host more than one panel at the same time. And this gives rise to what we call the programming track. So here is an example of a programming track from a furry con where you have different panel rooms that are divided based on themes that people could meet up at. So you would have, for example, an artist lounge, a writer's lounge, and even a fursuit lounge where you have these different panel rooms where they will have specific themed panels. But eventually the Star Trek fandom overwhelmed these science fiction cons, and just like the Gundinshi artists and the comic fans at these early science fiction cons would eventually be kicked out of the science fiction cons and go on to start their own Star Trek conventions. The first also happened in New York City. But what was different in this case was all these con founders, con chairs, and con staffers were all female. So this is where we get a shift to more female representation in the fandom scene as well. So what was interesting is the Star Trek cons really exploded out of the gate. 6,000 attendees, 15,000 attendees the next year started to really increase. And because of that, the traditional science fiction and comic cons, which catered to small crowds of a few hundred to maybe the low thousands at most, had to really change how they started to run conventions to accommodate for these larger sizes. And thus this gave rise to the gopher system at conventions and volunteer systems. This also gave rise to con security forces like the Doorside Irregulars or Flair at these cons as well. So we start seeing the roots of the modern convention template and con staffing emerge because the Star Trek fans had to accommodate larger and larger crowds of individuals. You can see this is Star Trek Lives, that Star Trek convention in New York. Worldcon is in blue, San Diego Comic-Con is in red, and you can see how big it came out of the gates, where it was the first convention to cross the 5-digit mark. We won't see another similar trend until the Bronies would come out in the 2010s. But because of that, the Star Trek fandom was forced to really organize stuff, and thus the Star Trek fandom kind of became the template for future cons. In fact, the future conventions would all be organized and run by people who formerly were running Star Trek cons. This is because when the Star Trek fandom started to decline and the attendance started to go down, they already made these well-oiled conventions. So all these former Star Trek cons started rebranding themselves as multimedia conventions or media conventions, and thus the torches passed from Worldcon, which at that time was the catch-all pop culture convention, to the Star Trek cons, now becoming the catch-all pop culture conventions. This also gives rise to the idea of cons not just run by volunteers, but cons run by professional con running groups, with the first of these being creation events, and later on you will have groups like ReedPop, Left Field, and Wizard World, and Fan Expo starting to run these conventions. But that's why when you look at pop culture during this time period, whenever they portray a convention, it is always filled with Star Trek fans, because Star Trek fans, Trekkies, were the default con runners of a lot of these early conventions as well. So the Star Trek cons, like I said, helped really got the programming track, multi-track programming started at these different conventions, and they innovated the exhibitor vendor hall to the point where this is where the hucksters hall started to dominate, and this is where we start seeing the divide between a traditional artist alley and the more exhibitor style hall that you see at these larger conventions. This is also where you get the rise of the celebrity zoo at these conventions. So a row where normally washed up horror and science fiction actors and actresses would just sign a bunch of autographs. So this is what you have at the big media conventions to this day. I don't think furries have an equivalent of that, luckily enough, but this is what kind of fills up a lot of these conventions during this period. But most importantly, I guess we could talk a little about costuming now, this is where Trekkies were able to do show-accurate costuming, because now you actually have a model to base your show off, your costuming off of, and this is where you get show-accurate costuming, with the term cosplay eventually being formed. But let's get to the furries, because this is where we get to the cartoon fantasy organization founded by, two members of the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society, Fred Patton and Mark Marlino. Fred Patton is kind of considered the father of anime fandom, while Mark Marlino is considered the father of furry fandom. These two individuals started the Cartoon Fantasy organization, which was specifically an anime fan club back when anime was known as Japanimation. So anime was very hard to get in the United States because it wasn't distributed for mass release. They would normally test anime in the West Coast and Hawaii, but these would be small broadcasts, and unless you recorded it on VHS, you would not be able to have access to this. So what the Cartoon Fantasy organization's purpose was to help with recording these bootleg VHS copies of anime screenings and distribute them around the United States to different college anime clubs where they would do screenings at these college campuses. Oftentimes they would have a TV setup where an interpreter would stand by the TV and basically talk about what was happening, because this was before subs and dubs were a thing, so kind of the early commentary channel style things. This is also weird to kind of express the feelings they were seeing with anime. They would start mashing up scenes of anime with music, giving rise to the AMV, the anime music video, which becomes a very, very big part of anime culture in the United States, and especially anime conventions. But because of the Cartoon Fantasy organization, which was purely started as an anime fan group, you could see most American anime cons, and thus anime cons in general, would come off of this organization. And then you'll also see the furries come off. So while anime cons and furry cons are very, very different to this day, they actually have the closest of roots coming off from the same organization.
When did anime first enter the United States?
50s and 60s was really when we started to get the rise of this. In fact, we could see this because you start seeing a lot of different science fiction and media conventions start catering to anime or Japanimation during this time period. But what was weird is, unlike the other groups that started in New York, it seemed to be Dallas where you started getting the race for hosting that first anime convention. Eventually, you got AnimeCon held in San Jose, staffed by people from BayCon. So BayCon and the Cartoon Fantasy organization would help give rise to AnimeCon, which became Anime Expo, which is very similar to what we will get with the furry fandom later on. And the AnimeCons gave rise to the Fan Art Artist Alley. And this actually becomes the more dominant artist alley that you see in the United States to this day, selling unofficial licensed IP, which also becomes very, very tricky when lawyers are walking around, which is why at MFF, you're not allowed to sell fan art there. If you notice why you can't buy Zootopia, Bluey, or Hell of a Boss merch in the dealer's den, is because there is a strict rule against selling IP if it's not an official product. Now, as the anime cons became formed, the notion for a Cartoon Fantasy organization kind of became defunct. So there was no longer a need for the Cartoon Fantasy organization, and thus Mark decided to reorganize the Cartoon Fantasy organization to throw parties for people who love another aspect of the anime they were watching. They all became fascinated by anthropomorphic characters in anime. And this again was during a time where Steve Galetti and other individuals were selling zines and comics with anthropomorphic animals. So they decided to continue the cartoon fantasy organization for their love of anthropomorphic characters and throw room parties at these science fiction cons, including the first room party called the Prancing Skilter Party. The Skilter, which was a mascot of the West Coast version of the cartoon fantasy organization, at WesterCon in 1985, the science fiction con that was held on the West Coast. This was called the first funny animal party. Funny animal because the term furry did not exist back then. Funny animal, there's two theories of where that term comes from. First is because they were literal funny cartoon animals. Second, because funny was a term for newspaper comics during this period. So these were animals in the funnies. So there's two possible routes for why they were called funny animal fandom during this time period. But the Prancing Skilter Party basically became the major routes for the furry cons to eventually branch off from. And just like the Trekkies, the Dondinshi artists, and the comics fans who overwhelmed their local science fiction convention and held big room parties that started to overflow, they were kicked out of their local science fiction cons and decided to form their own convention. And this is what happened with the Prancing Skilter Party, where they weren't specifically booted out, but they completely overwhelmed the convention party floor and thus decided to create their own convention. Mark and his partner, Rod, then decided to form what's considered the first furry convention conference in 1989. And actually, this would mean the furry cons predate the anime cons by a year. So the furry cons actually came first. So these furry cons specifically took over the science fiction model for the conventions scene. So you would start seeing conference starting to form the template for these future furry conventions. Specifically, what was unique about the furry cons is they kept a lot of the science fiction con model. Because the comic cons branched off first, they had a completely separate evolution from the 60s onwards, basically forming their own type of models for running conventions. And if you notice, the comic cons broke off before things like concerts were a thing. This is why comic cons do not have concerts. But cons that came after concerts were introduced, like anime and furry cons, do have a concert scene. All these conventions kept the cosplay masquerade, which I'll talk about a bit later. But because the anime cons blew up in attendance really, really fast, they were forced to leave the hotel block model, which the furry cons kept, and move into a convention center, adopting the trade show model. So because the furry cons were relatively small during this time period, they were able to keep the hotel block model that the science fiction cons have and kept it kind of one per one. And eventually these would start evolving. The huckster's room eventually became the dealer's den. The hospitality suite eventually became the zoo. But you start seeing a lot of the similar traditions, like the art show and the programming track, kept by these furry cons. And most importantly, a lot of these old furry cons kept the party floor, which was very important. We're going to talk a little bit about these later. But I think one of the most important things the furry cons had was actually, let's go back to this model. So very similar story is the furries at the local Philadelphia convention, PhilCon, started to overwhelm PhilCon, and eventually they were kicked out of PhilCon and eventually became what we now know as Anthrocon. Very, very similar with MFF, which was started as a furry trek at DuckCon, and eventually the furry track grew and grew and grew in size, and eventually the programming track at DuckCon eventually became what we now know as Midwest Fur Fest. And I think DuckCon realized that the furries ended up becoming one of their major audiences, because they later started to invite furry personalities like Uncle Kage as their guest of honor for their con, I think trying to win back a lot of their furry audiences that they lost. So I'm going to quickly go through this because I think I'm running out of time, but this is where Comic-Con really booms on the scene. The idea of a professional-run con started to grow. This is where cons started to really dominate in size. This is where we start getting the rise of corporate events running these conventions as well. Bronies come on the scene, again, out of New York City. Purple Tinkers started to help run the first Brony conventions. It basically boomed in attendance, and eventually the Bronies really dominated the scene to the point there was more Brony cons happening in the country than, Star Trek and Harry Potter and Star Wars cons combined. The Bronies basically took a mixed model. While some Brony cons were started in a furry con model, some were started in the anime con model, but mainly it was depending on which local group helped organize that BronyCon would inform that model. But that very first BronyCon New York was founded as a mix between Star Trek and furry conventions. Then Las Vegas Unicon happened. This was basically the DashCon the year before DashCon happened. This basically caused the Brony scene to go into emergency mode and try to clamp down on the amount of cons that were happening. This forced the Bronies to form a lot of new innovations in the con scene, including introducing what's called the VIPR department, VIP Relations Department, also shortened as Viper. And from this, the Bronies started to evolve and emerge a lot of new different innovations to the con scene, including having a kids-only room, since there was a lot of younger fans. Bronies also had a very unique culture with their mascots. So so every single Brony convention will have their own set of mascots, to the point the mascots would even have their own fan bases around them. They would make a bunch of plushies and merch with their mascots on them, and this becomes a very big part of Brony convention scenes. Something that you don't really see as much in the furry scene. You don't really see plushies of con mascots on the same level like you see with the Bronies as well. The Brony fandom had its own modern evolution, but what was more interesting is they were the first to really adopt an online platform. So what was the central hub for the science fiction cons would have been those early zines, the letter columns, would have been the central hub for the furry fandom, would have been Furry Muck and all these online forums. But this would be what Equestria Daily and all these different news sites were for the Brony fandom. And this also would start a lot of podcast networks. And to fill up space between the podcasters, this is where you'll put Brony musicians. And this is where musicians really took over the Brony fandom. A lot of these Brony musicians would become famous musicians in their own right to this day, like Living Tombstone, Eurobeat, like the Microphone, all these different individuals would branch off. In fact, if you look at a lot of modern stuff like Five Nights at Freddy's, all the way to Has Been Hotel, you'll see a lot of Brony musicians having their hand in a lot of the modern animation scene as well. And thus that meant the Bronies had to throw epic concerts. And to have epic concerts, you had to have a good AV team. So this is where Bronies really innovated on having a strong AV team that a lot of other cons didn't innovate with. So you do have concerts at anime cons, but the Brony concerts were really heavy to original fan music, which made the Bronies concerts very different from what we got with other fandoms. So even at furry cons to this day, when you go to the raves and concerts, they are still just playing remixes of pre-existing songs. But with the Brony scene, it was a mix of different music. They'll do folk style music, orchestra style music, electronic rock music, but it was all mainly fan music, which really made it stand out in that level of filk. And because there were so much musicians, they couldn't possibly fill the they already had the full concert list. So they decided to make a separate area called the Renegade Stage, where musicians who were not on the main concert list could step in and play. So the Renegade Stage becomes a place where all these smaller musicians to really get their start. And you can see what the Renegade Stage is really a mirror to what these filk breakout rooms ended up being, the filk circles. So you can see Bronies are basically continuing tradition of what filk music was with the Renegade stuff. BabsCon was actually the only BronyCon that was formed, that was helped staffed by science fiction fans. So BayCon and Further Confusion had a big hand in helping BabsCon get started. And thus, because of that science fiction tradition, BabsCon was the only PonyCon to start with a party floor. And so BabsCon was really known as the party convention at the Pony scene, and it took a lot of DNA from the science fiction cons. In fact, BabsCon is the only PonyCon to also have a hospitality suite and an art show, because it basically took this DNA from the science fiction scene as well. Most importantly, the Brony fandom is very, very queer and inclusive. In fact, it's heavily trans-dominated. If you look at the founders and con-chairs for a lot of these early Brony cons, they were mainly trans women. So because the Brony fandom has a big community of trans individuals, it would make sense that the Bronies were really the first to introduce pronoun ribbons as a default staple for their conventions, and also the communication tags and the gender-neutral bathrooms. So while some cons might have started the communication, the pronoun ribbons first, it was Bronies on a whole that adopted this as a mass on the conventions, and BronyCon was the first to introduce these communication tags. In fact, the first furry con to do this would be 5 years later with MFF doing that. So these are things that the Bronies would influence furries. So it's funny that we furries influenced the Brony fandom, and thus the Brony fandom helped influence the furry fandom back. In fact, most of the Brony, the evolutions in the furry convention scene, you could see were influence from the Bronies. In fact, so there's that joke where we always say Bronies are technically a type of furry. So if we consider Brony a type of furry, and we consider Brony conventions a type of furry con, that would actually mean the Brony cons were the largest furry conventions during this period. In fact, that would mean Brony Convention in 2015 was technically the first furry con to hit 5 digits in attendance. It was the first to cross the 10K mark in attendance. And even though BronyCon ended back in 2019, BronyCon would still be considered the 4th largest furry con if we include it on the list of furry cons. Another thing that really got started with the furry convention, with the Brony convention scene, is this group called Corgi Events. So they started running originally Brony conventions before they started making fursuits through Lemon Brat, and eventually started to make their own furry conventions. Of course, there was some drama with Corgi Events, and eventually split into 2 groups, with the Pony Events now under Worthwhile Events, and AEI now running the former furry side of Corgi Events. Because the Bronies were very, very tech savvy, it would make sense that the Bronies were the first to have virtual conventions during the pandemic lockdown. In fact, Bronies were already hosting online events during this period. So they'll host these big online concert events. A lot of these Brony conventions would happen in virtual reality, including Ponytown, where you can make your own little avatar sprite and see panels and musician events played on big screens, and including one Brony convention in Southeast Asia, recreating a convention center in Minecraft that you could walk around in. And of course, it will inspire the furries to do the same with Second Life. And of course, the furries would give rise to groups like Fur Reality, which would include the Fur Reality virtual reality portals that after the pandemic made its way to a lot of modern furry cons today. So again, the rivalry between Bronies and furries actually helped each of these cons innovate with each other. So cruises started to become a very big thing, a convention cruise. So the first one was the furry cruise, and later on that would inspire, apparently I'm the co-founder of Sea Bronies. I'm listed on the masthead of this, but I've never actually been involved in this convention at all, but I'm listed as a co-founder for some reason. But BronyCons, Brony and Star Trek cruises also emerged around this time, and San Diego Comic-Con finally is hosting its first cruise on the seas as well. So that concludes the previous portion of the panel. So let's quickly jump into the costume section, because this is what this section of the panel is supposed to be. So let's get started with the costuming section. So costuming has been a big thing in the early period. So before we had conventions, there were attempts to dress up at these events as well. Now, you had Victorian balls and bazaars that would promote science fiction stories, and you would have what we might call proto-fursuits during this period. A lot of early attempts to do costuming. However, let's go back to that first fan personality. Remember when we were talking about Forrest J. Ackerman? I guess he would be considered the equivalent of being Poppy Fur during this time period, the big fan personality. In fact, he was awarded the first Hugo Award as the #1 fan. He cosplayed as this character from the H.G. Wells movie, Things to Come. His girlfriend, Moroyo, made him the costume. So when he arrived in New York for Worldcon, I guess a bunch of the Futurians greeted him as he got off the bus. And one of the Futurians, a short, little 15-year-old kid who had a cigarette in his mouth named Cyril Kornbluth, you might recognize later as a science fiction author, went up to Forrest J. Ackerman and said, "Are you that Forrest J. Ackerman who's writing all these letters?" And Forrest was like, "Yes," and Cyril punched him in the stomach. So that was his welcome to New York City. Now, Forrest J. Ackerman, even though he was a big fan personality, he was writing to all the fanzines and science magazines, he was actually shy and socially awkward in real life. So they were wanting him to give speeches at Worldcon, and he was just very, very introverted. In fact, they asked him to give an impromptu speech at Worldcon, and just the thought of giving a speech gave him a headache. Luckily, the wife of John Campbell gave him an aspirin, so he was finally able to go on stage and give his speech. Now, even though he was socially awkward, in modern terms, he might be neurodivergent because he was so excited to wear his cosplay that he wore it the entire con and would wear it when they were going out in New York, on the streets of New York, even wearing it to the World's Fair. So this, as the first cosplayer, he was wearing a costume before the concept of a cosplay lounge existed, so he couldn't really change if he wanted to. So once he put on his costume, he was stuck wearing that costume the entire day. However, he was saying wearing the costume felt like being Superman, and he had a complete personality change when he put on his costume. Luckily enough, he was friends with the creator of Superman, so he could probably tell him this story as well. But so he and a bunch of the Worldcon attendees went to the World's Fair, and at the World's Fair, there was a stage where people from different countries could go up and speak in their own native language. Forrest J. Ackerman took this opportunity to go on stage and speak in Esperanto. And then in Esperanto basically said, "I'm a time traveler from the future." So there's where you get a lot of fun Forrest J. Ackerman stuff. So as like I said, he was a co-creator of Vampirilla and Famous Monsters of Filmland. He was also given the title Honorary Lesbian because he wrote articles for that first lesbian fanzine as well. So here is Ackerman at Caravan Hall. Caravan Hall was the location of that first Worldcon. I actually found these photos recently. These are photos of the cosplay. Apparently they were up for auction at some point in time. I have no idea what happened to them, but you can see that these are actually the colorized versions of his cosplay. And actually, if you actually look in the, I think in this this is the furry version of Forrest J. Ackerman that I drew in the book. So I guess furry J. Ackerman, if you would say, wearing that cosplay. So this is Moroyo who cosplayed with him. That's the thing, a lot of people forget that Moroyo also, while she wasn't the first cosplayer, she did cosplay at that first Worldcon as well, so she's the second cosplayer, but she did make their costume, so she is the first costume maker, and they have both properly been honored as the first cosplayer, the mothers and fathers of cosplays now at this time. What's interesting is Moroyo was like 12 years older than Forrest J. Ackerman, so it's like weird because she was 12 years older, yet she was a fangirl of this young 20-year-old kid who was a big fan personality. I guess they had a falling out later on. but they were very connected during this period. So let's talk about Moroyo, also known by her actual name, Meryl Douglas. She was the treasurer for Philosophes. They both lent money to Ray Bradbury to travel to that first Worldcon. And like I said, she was responsible because Forrest J. Ackerman was wearing his costume all day since he had no place to change. She decided to offer her room 689, for costumers to change. By that second Worldcon, everyone was inspired to dress up in costumes, and thus her hotel room is kind of considered the first cosplay lounge and also considered the first con suite. And it was just an impromptu way of her just offering her hotel suite for people to change. And since the headless lounge actually emerged from the costume lounge, you could kind of trace her for being the origins of the headless lounge at FurryCons as well. So at that second Worldcon, they decided to dress up in costume and have a costume contest. They called their costume contest masquerades, costume masquerades, a term that sticks to this day. That's why if you go to a Comic-Con or an Anime Con and you see that their costume contest is called a costume masquerade, this is where it originates from. So after they got changed, Forrest had them walk down the streets of Chicago, just like he did New York, and they went to one of the newspaper offices in Chicago, and he basically said, we are time travelers from the future, and you're going to take a picture of us and publish it in tomorrow's newspaper. We know because we're from the future. They got apparently a group photo taken, but it was never published, and we can't find this photo, so apparently this photo was taken, but there's no actual evidence of the photo existing, so hopefully that turns up someday. But they had that first costume contest, which was called a masquerade, and that masquerade also included skits where people would act in their costumes. Jerry Siegel, the co-creator of Superman, also cosplayed as Clark Kent at that second Worldcon as well. So surprisingly, the winner of that first costume masquerade was that troublemaker, David A. Kyle, the publisher of that yellow pamphlet, and he won for his Ming the Merciless costume, funny enough. So costuming would evolve at the science fiction cons over the next few decades, and David A. Kyle would pop up again and try to use costuming as a means to market his conventions. So he ended up marrying the model Louis Miles. So he would use his model wife to promote his bid for Worldcon and would market her as Miss Science Fiction. So unfortunately, even with all his attempts to use his wife as Miss Science Fiction, he actually lost that bid for that 1950 Worldcon, which ended up being won by Portland, known as NorwestCon. And NorwestCon was actually the first documented stage masquerade. It's also where the first Dianetic session took place by Edward Hopper as well, which is kind of funny as well. But that stage masquerade was very different from the masquerade costume contest that came before, because this is where you start seeing codified rules for costume judging at these early conventions. And this is where we get the emergence of more prominent female cosplayers, including Olga Ley. Olga Ley has been described as the most beautiful costumer and the first great costumer by fan historians. This is her costume, Deep Space. So women at the 1955 Worldcon really made a presence, and this is where we have Olga Ley and Karen Anderson, the woman who started the typo that coined the word folk music, being very, very prominent at these 1950 Worldcons. So here's colorized versions of the costume. Here's Olga Ley in her Deep Space cosplay, and here is Karen Anderson in her outfit. Now, Karen Anderson was interesting because she would start cosplaying with her daughter, Idrid, and they would do dual costumings together at these conventions. And what was funny was when I did my presentation at Worldcon and I had my display that this year's Worldcon, an old woman came up behind me and said, "Oh, that's my mother." And then I realized, oh wait, that means that you're Idrid. So so the daughter of Karen Anderson surprisingly just walked up to my display and we talked about it a little bit. So that was kind of interesting. So the mother-daughter pair would do a lot of dual cosplays together, and they would actually innovate the cosplay scene. So Karen dressed up as a vampire, while her daughter dressed up as the bite victim, and they used gelatin to simulate blood. So nowadays, fake blood is a big part of modern costuming, but this was considered an innovation for the early costuming scene during this period as well. So they were the first to do a lot of innovations with early costuming. Now, again, this was a period where the comics fandom was trying to become recognized as its own separate fandom from science fiction. And to do this, along with comic conventions, comic zines were also being published to give legitimacy to comics as separate from science fiction. And the editors of the fanzine Zero, husband-wife pair, Dick and Pat, ended up cosplaying as Captain Marvel and Mary Marvel at Worldcon to help promote their zine. Their zine actually won the Hugo Award for Best Fanzine, but this is some of the earliest superhero costuming that we'll see at these early science fiction cons. And of course, like I said, the Star Trek cons, being a heavily female fan base, would start doing a lot of cross cosplay, so cross-gender cosplaying. But most importantly, the Star Trek fandom introduced show-accurate costuming, because up to this point, most costumes were based off imaginations or as close as you could replicate the cover art. But now that you actually had a TV show of real costumes that you can model off of, this is where you try to get to accuracy cosplaying, and this gave rise to a lot of different show-accurate costume contests as well. What's interesting is the cosplay that won this Star Trek costume contest is actually Spock's pet from the Star Trek animated series. This female cosplayer was a filker and zine publisher as well, and I don't think I've never seen any furry history talk about this, but I could argue that this might be one of the earliest instances of a fursuit or a proto-fursuit on the stage at a convention costume contest and actually winning first place. So Fern might be considered the first fursuit cosplayer at a convention, though she's only really known in Star Trek fandom and not in furry fandom. So the next cosplayer I want to talk about is one of the co-founders of San Diego Comic-Con. So aside from Ken Kruger and Cheryl Dorf, one of the other individuals who's responsible for founding San Diego Comic-Con is Scott Shaw. Scott Shaw created a character called the Turd for a comic zine. The Turd was a monster made out of poop, and so he decided to cosplay at Worldcon dressed up as his Turd character, where he would wear a bathing suit and a stocking over his head and slather himself up with crunchy peanut butter. And unfortunately, the peanut butter got really rancid fast and would drip off under the hot convention lights. And even with these circumstances, he decided to enter the cosplay contest, and they created a new category for him, winning the most revolting costume. Now, after this, he had to take a shower to wash all this stuff off. And the hotel maid actually came in and he tried to explain what was happening. And she actually said, I've seen worse. However, a week later, the con staff got a call from the hotel saying, our drains are clogged and they're filled with peanut butter. And legend goes that the con staff was responsible for billed thousands of dollars for hotel repairs to fix these pipes. And because of this, the official Rule 7 for costume contests, in fact, this is the rules that were codified for these early science fiction costume contests are now used for every single comic and anime convention costuming rule. Rule 7 states, parts of your costume should not be edible or smell. It should not fall off accidentally, be brushed off against other contestants, or left lying on the stage. And this rule was added because of Scott Shaw. So the next innovation in costuming came by accident. So a Japanese fan, Mary, at a science fiction convention in Japan, dressed up as a character from an Edgar Rice Burroughs novel. a fighting man of Mars. So this was her cosplay. However, a lot of other con attendees thought she was cosplaying as a Tezuka anime character. And because of this, a lot of people thought, hey, if she could cosplay as an anime character, we could as well. So she unintentionally inspired a bunch of con attendees to start dressing up as anime and manga characters, which wasn't a thing up to this point. So she unintentionally started cosplay as we know it in Japan. However, the first anime character to be cosplayed in America was Karen Dick, and she cosplayed as Captain Harlock at San Diego Comic-Con, and she is considered the first anime cosplayer outside of Japan as well. Karen Anderson would eventually help found the Fantasy Costumers Guild, and also would found Costume Con, a convention dedicated to costuming, and this would later evolve into the International Costumers Guild. The International Costumers Guild is now the de facto organization that monitors and runs and organizes all the costume contests at all the different cons around the world. In fact, the rules that are codified by the Costumers Guild are now used as the cosplay judging rules at all conventions to this day. They also eventually honored both Forrest J. Ackerman and Muroyo as the mother and father of cosplay later on. Now, when Japanese fans were going to America and seeing how cosplay was done at Worldcon, they wanted to describe it. This Japanese writer went to Worldcon and he was specifically impressed with the costume cosplays of Trekkies. And he wanted to describe how he was seeing these Trekkies cosplay at Worldcon. However, the term costume masquerade did not translate correctly into Japan, because masquerade in Japan translates to a high society ball, which is very, very different to the costuming that was happening at these conventions. So he decided to create a term called costume play, which was shortened to cosplay, and thus we get the term cosplay being used as a definition for this type of costuming. So cosplay started to become very big in the United States as well. These early anime cons in the United States would invite famous Japanese cosplayers as their first guests of honors, including this individual who was actually a very famous manga artist, and she actually became called the most famous manga artist in the United States simply because American fans loved her cosplay and were constantly invited her as guest of honor at American cons. So you can see her as one of the guests of honor at Katsucon, and another picture of her in the early dealer halls at these anime cons as well. So, like I said, the Cartoon Fantasy Organization and BayCon gave birth to both anime fandom and furry fandom. Specifically, it gave birth to the anime cons because the Japanese cons during this time period were either following the Worldcon science fiction model or they were following the Comic-Con model. So ironically enough, even though Japan is where anime and manga is from, the concept of an anime con would actually start in America first, and then make its way back to Japan, where they were called American-style conventions, because these American conventions had a very different format, using guest of honors, having giant industry halls, and whatnot. But let's go back to the furries, because this is where we start getting the rise of a lot of furry individuals who would kind of become the innovators for fursuiters. So outside of that one Star Trek cosplay, this is where we start seeing individuals who would kind of give rise to what we now know as the fursuits. And the first individual I want to mention is Robert Hill. Robert Hill was involved with a furry zine called Raw Brazzo, and he was also working as a character performer at Disney. Let me see, so this is him dressing up in Disneyland costumes. So he specifically decided to take inspiration from how Disney were doing their costumes, because up to this point, most of these proto fursuits were more based off sports mascot costumes. And he decided to take the more show accurate models that Disney characters have and use them in his costume, including creating his most famous creation, Hilda the Bamboy, which is one of the most famous early fursuits during this period. And as you can see, also has a lot of cross-play costuming where people would cosplay as the opposite gender. As this makes sense because the early furry fandom was heavily queer dominated, so you'll see a lot of cross-dressing like this in drag shows, performances, and burlesque shows as well. So the term fursuit was actually eventually coined by, funny enough, the founder of Midwest Fur Fest, Robert King, who was the one who started that furry track at DuckCon. Like I said, that furry track would outgrow DuckCon and become Midwest Fur Fest as we know it. He would create a mailing list called the Fursuit mailing list. Fursuit was actually a reference to pursuit, so that's where we get the term fursuit from. And this is where we believe this is the first coined term. This is the first instance where the term fursuit was coined in its modern definition. Now, in industry costumings, fursuit was just used for any hairy costume, but fursuit as a specific furry outfit, mascot style outfit, was first coined by Robert King, and this is actually one of his outfits. He's actually cosplaying as a skunk character created by Ken Sample. Ken Sample is the individual who created the mascot for the East Coast branch of the Cartoon Fantasy organization. He created a character, original species called the Philansec. So Philansec was separate from the skilled hair. So you can see, of course, the furry fandom was creating original species, which is a big part of the furry fandom. Even to this day, we have creatures like Nova Beast, Prelogens, Wicker Beast, and whatnot being a big part of the fan community. Ken Sample is also believed to be the guy who created the concept of the fursona and the fursona badge as well. But it was Robert King who was the one who coined the term fursuit and is the founder of this convention as well. Now, the next major innovation at the furry cons was moving the costume masquerade. So since furry cons came off of the science fiction cons, that means they also kept the costume masquerade. The costume masquerade was the big highlight event of science fiction cons. The costume masquerade had the honored time slot of Saturday evening. However, because furries were now introducing a lot of new elements, the furry cons started to move the costume masquerade to Saturday afternoon. However, because they moved the costume masquerade to Saturday afternoon, this meant that the dealers who were stuck in the dealer's den were deprived of seeing the costumes. And this was before modern innovations in fursuiting, so most of these fursuits were very hot, very heavy, and were only worn for one time, and that one time was the costume masquerade. So these dealers were unable to see these costumes. So what they decided to do is, after the masquerade was done, was march all the fursuiters through the dealer's den, starting what we now know as the fursuit parade. Now there's two claimants for who started the fursuit parade. Now, Mark Marlino claims it was a furry convention in Memphis in 1997 that started the tradition of the fursuit parade. But the most, the claim that is, I guess, most asserted in the fandom, and is the one that we now take as actual history, is when Yappy, who was the individual who was leading the fursuit parade at Albany Anthrocon back when it was in Albany, also the same year in 1997, marched those fursuiters from the costume masquerade for the dealer's den, that the fursuit parade really begun. In fact, Yappy at Anthrocon, even recently, has normally been the one to lead the fursuit parade if he was in attendance. So both these, there are two different claims for what was the first fursuit parade, but both of them did start in 1997, and both cons were a month apart from each other, so we could at least nail it down to those specific dates. But Yappy is the one who is most cited as the one to start that first parade as well. So because of this, fursuiting has also emerged like we were talking about there's fandom drama with the Futurians and new fandom. And so it makes sense that fandom drama will carry over to the furry fandom, especially with costuming. Specifically, this is a period where we get the furries versus the anthros. So the furry fandom was founded by queer individuals, so they would have a lot more skimpy outfits that a lot of people might say were probably not safe for work or not really kid friendly. But it would make sense because this was a fandom founded by adult individuals in a queer community. So they will wear a lot of leather-based outfits, latex-based outfits, a lot of cross-dressing type outfits. However, because the furry fandom was heavily alienated during this time period, just like the furries and just like the bronies and the Trekkies, they were mocked in the media. So a lot of the new furry cons that were emerging during this period wanted to have better PR. So there was a shift to make furry family friendly, and this gave rise to the anthros, where they wanted to make the furry fandom much more PG, so clamping down on these specific outfits, including the quad suits were a big thing that were clamped down on, pup hoods, and a lot of other stuff. This debate still continues to this day, so even this year alone, there was the entire debate on poodling being not allowed at the fursuit parade at Anthrocon. There was an entire event where quad suits were banned at Anthro New England, and that ended up with the boards firing the founders and chairs of Anthro New England because they were clamping down on the quad suit ban as well. Even more conservative-leaning furry cons like Anthro Northwest has really, really strict restrictions on costuming. Even for the longest time, you couldn't even wear a collar at Anthro Northwest since that was considered adult. Even to this day, Anthro Northwest does not allow scary outfits. So no scary outfits or outfits with spikes are allowed. So even to this day, there's still a lot of debates with fursuiting, and this also leads into issues because fursuits are very, very hot and very, very heavy. So the idea that cons need to have more fursuit lounges become very, very important. Like I said, the fursuit lounge came from Arroyo's cosplay lounge. So furries kept that tradition. I think they innovated it with fursuit headless lounges having fans and water inside. However, unfortunately, a lot of cons, because fursuit headless lounges take up a lot of space, are cramming them away, moving them to odd locations. So I know there was a big complaint with FWA this year, where the fursuit, there normally is a headless lounge on every level. And this year, because they had to make room for the concert, they actually removed the second floor headless lounge, which made it hard for furries to move around as well. So yeah, so these are the quad suits. This is the first time I learned the term B-word suit as well, which was kind of weird. You see bronies also fursuiting as well. So back on the outside of the furry convention scene, as the furries are dealing with their anthro versus furry dramas, cosplay contests started to emerge in the Worldcon space. Specifically, this is where we start to get codified rules for judging cosplay contests. It was at the Worldcon in Denver that we got the first official standardized judging rules for costuming, where they would rank cosplays on a 3-tiered structure. And eventually, in Japan, you would get the first International World Cosplay Summit. Specifically in Japan, and then American anime cons, you would start seeing cosplay culture emerging to the point that cosplay, in Japan, you would have your own cosplay magazines, websites, and even dedicated stores for selling cosplay as well. So, contact lenses started to become really, really big with the Japanese costuming scene. You will have a lot of foam bases being sold to use for cosplays. You also see a bunch of creative costuming. So this was at the Marriott in Atlanta, where FWA is held. This is where Dragon Con is held, and you see these funny camo pattern based on the rug pattern. This is also where you start seeing cosplayers becoming now recognized as major fan personalities to the point where they are now honored as guests of honor at these conventions. And then also in Japan, you start seeing their own separate evolution for fursuits, where you have the kimono style fursuits, mainly with these big anime-style eyes that are covered by glass or plastic, emerging in Japan with big padded legs as well. So you start seeing a new type of cosplay emerging out of Japan. Of course, there's a lot of controversy outside of furry cons as well. So Nazi cosplay, Italia cosplay started making its way into anime cons, which caused a lot of issues. There was a lot of harassment for female cosplayers, which is very unfortunate. And a modern interpretation of the peanut butter clogging the drains at Worldcon is you have the Homestuck Sharpie bath incident at Anime Expo, where someone ended up trying to dye their skin gray by being in a bath of alcohol and Sharpies, and that completely stained the hotel. So this is a modern version of the turret outfit. But despite all the drama, you still have a lot of cosplayers making their way, being represented at a lot of these conventions, where especially in the Brony fandom, you have a large range of female cosplayers and even young cosplayers being represented at these conventions as well. The Bronies also make their own variations of fursuits. So you start seeing a lot of Brony fursuiters as well, which is also interesting because Everfree Northwest, which is currently the largest BronyCon, is held in the same hotel that Rainforest was kicked out of. And now that hotel has a rule where fursuits are banned. But because Everfree was grandfathered in, the Bronies were technically the last fursuiters allowed at that hotel, even years after they started the no fursuit ban. And I know because I was trying to start a small convention in that same hotel, and apparently that fursuit ban is still in effect to this day. Unfortunately, the Bronies and furries still have fightings between each other, and so even at BronyCons, there's hate towards fursuits as well, which is odd because fursuits are welcomed at pony conventions, but then there are dumb people are trying to start fights, basically saying no furries or fursuits allowed at our con, which is just really, really dumb. But especially with the furry scene, you had a question?
What exactly caused the ban on the fursuits?
There's a con in Orlando where I live now called Mare Fair. It is the Amber Northwest of furry cons, of BronyCons, and it's run by 4chan edgelords that want to separate themselves from furries. I don't want to get into the drama because it's really, really weird, but they basically are saying we want a space without fursuiters, which is really, really dumb. So they're trying to be the clean adult friendly. It's ironic because actually Amber Northwest is trying to be the clean family friendly con. This is the clean adult pony convention. But the Brony so I don't want to use this con to judge Bronies because most of the Brony fandom, 99% of Brony fandom does not like this convention, and they've actually been in a campaign to call the hotel to make sure that this con is not welcome back. So this con has happened 3 times, and they had to be in a different hotel each time because they were kicked out of each hotel they were at because of the Brony fandom, making sure this con isn't welcome in their fandom. And because of that, I don't think they're going to be back. But yeah, they were the ones who had the stupid animal man go home sticker that was passed around at this year's con. So I actually went incognito to the con this year, and yeah, it's just kind of weird how it was evident. But yeah, going back to the nicer stuff. So now that the tide has changed and furries are now kind of welcomed back by the general public, fursuiters have become like kind of the ambassadors for the furry fandom at these different conventions, to the point where cities like Pittsburgh now have fursuit parades and furries are now welcome. I actually fursuit as my Bash of Pinata fursuit at San Diego Comic-Con and Worldcon. In fact, I was actually at the Worldcon Masquerade this year in Seattle. If we had the audio set up, I would play it, but I think I might be one of the first fursuiters at a Worldcon Masquerade, the oldest masquerade in the world, and I only joined last minute because someone saw my fursuit and was like, hey, you should do the masquerade, it's in 12 hours. But the masquerade, like I said, the science fiction masquerade, you had to perform a 1-minute skit. And once I found out it was the 85th anniversary of the first Worldcon Masquerade, I was like, oh, I had to do something. So I put together a 1-minute medley of folk music over the last 85 years, and basically in 1 minute dance to all these different folk and fan songs in pursuit. And actually, it's funny because I actually included brony and furry music, so I included Eurobeat and Living Tombstone songs, as well as Pepper and other furry musicians. And someone actually mentioned this might be the first time that brony and furry music has officially played on the Worldcon Masquerade stage, which I think is actually kind of funny, since that is the oldest masquerade in the world. So yes, furries are now kind of more honored and represented at different cons across the country. And with that, I think that concludes my panel. Exactly on time. So thank you all for coming.